Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Ich versuche zuerst auf Deutsch sprechen. Ich freue mich sehr, dass ich hier in München bin. Das ist eine meiner beliebtesten Städte in Deutschland. Ich habe gerade studiert hier und dann geforscht bei dem Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte. Aber leider habe ich Deutsch nicht genug gut gelernt, diese Vortrag auf Deutsch zu sprechen, sonst englische Sprache. I wanted to take you to the Young Poland period and to introduce you to this phenomenon in Polish art history, which is by far the most popular and most influential until today in Poland. In our cultural history, Young Poland occupies a very significant place, and looking at this exhibition, you may understand why it has such a visual impact still nowadays. But it's even more interesting to have a look at its historical pedigree and understand why it happened that Young Poland became such an important cultural phenomenon in Poland. So let me start first with the proper name of the movement. Młoda Polska, direct translation is Young Poland. This name came from a series of articles published in 1898 in a journal called Życie Life, which was published in Kraków and Lviv, in Austria and then Galicia, in Polish language. They were written by art critic, literary critic, journalist Artur Górski. He took this name from several other young nations in Europe. There was Young Belgium, Young Scandinavian movements. Jugendstil is also referring to the youth in its name. So it was a name sort of a common in Europe at that time. Yet in Polish context it had a very particular meaning. And I'm showing you precisely the first chapter of the series of articles here in Życie. So you see this is the first time that Młoda Polska appeared in flesh, written. So what did he write there? And that's the important thing. He basically pointed out that there is a revolutionary movement taking place in Poland right now. Poland, and we'll come to this in a moment, of a non-existing country. He emphasized the fact that this is the end of positivism in sort of scientific approach to art and the world, inherited from the previous generation, that we all need to rediscover Romanticism as the source of fundamental changes. Romanticism, especially Polish poetry. He wrote about Polish romantic poet Adam Mickiewicz of the early 19th century as his role model. And he said that this new art needed no longer the scientific approach to world, but art that wanted to be based on emotions, personal feelings, and morally heroic, homely, with aesthetic freedom and no longer sociological oriented art. It was art about individualism. In the same time, he was very much looking for art that is not decadent. He was very much against decadentism, saying that decadentism has beautiful wings that are impossible to fly. So he was against art for art's sake. He wanted art that will resonate between artist and society, and art that will be based on moral values, that will be homely, and will speak about Polish national ambitions and hopes for independence. And I think this is precisely what we will be looking at today. Art that is a silent rebellion. And I have to say that this title of the Munich Kunsthalle is such a good title to explain the Polish art and its impact. And I really congratulate Kunsthalle for this exhibition, and I'm very happy to be part of the program accompanying it, because I think it's one of the best exhibitions of Young Poland that definitely I have seen, and that happened after the Second World War around the world. This art has been shown internationally, not so much, but there were exhibitions, but this one is definitely standing out. Okay, so we are now looking at Young Poland that is also, as you see, artistic and in a way political concept, and it's based on the cultural policy rather than real politics. Why so? I mean, we have to remember that this is all happening in a country which has no borders because it doesn't exist. We remember, I'm sure, that Poland lost its independence at the end of 18th century, being divided between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And when young Poland is emerging, the country does not exist. This is a traumatic experience for Polish nation, obviously, at that stage. This is already over 100 years after the end of Poland as an independent country. Yet, the spirit of national liberation and spirit of revival suddenly reappears. And I think this also influences a great deal the power of this art, that they have this silent rebellion in it. But they rebel not against something very, very soft or easy, you see. They somehow rebel against the cultural map of Europe too. Because we are looking at the political map, obviously. This is where Kraków is. Warsaw, Kraków is part of Austria, Warsaw is part of Russia. Poznan, the biggest Polish city in the western Poland now, is part of United Germany. But this is also a cultural map of Europe, and I think this is also very important to realize, that European map of culture has been rewritten as well. That there were major cultures in Europe that deserved attention. British, French, German, and in the East, the great Russian culture. There was no place for any other cultures in between. Okay, they were existing, they were national languages, but they were reduced to some kind of regional phenomenon. So also on the cultural map of Europe, there was no Poland. And I think these artists also struggled to have recognition as Polish artists, as a cultural field, cultural space that exists between Germany and Russia, or for, we would say now, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania. So there is a new window to be opened. There is a new art that will speak again to emphasize that there exists something also in the center of Europe, also culturally. This idea of non-existing of Poland was so widespread, so there was much to rebel against. Let me only mention the famous 1888 work by Alfred Jarry, the French poet, playwright, who is considered one of the forerunners of surrealism. He wrote this rather well-known in Poland play called Ubu Roi pour les Polonais, so about the King Ubu or the Poles, which is an absurd and grotesque, full of satire story about incompetent king and rather bizarre society which he rules. But most importantly, he wanted to create this absurd world, and he placed it in Poland because, as he wrote at the bottom of the title, it takes place in Poland. That means nowhere. And I think this idea to regain the existence and to give it a new meaning is one of those aims of the silent rebellion that took place around 1900, and which you can see now in Kunsthalle München. So let's have a look first, and I'll divide this lecture in three points I want to make. The first one is about the figures, the artists who actually made this non-existing land, non-existing culture, for that sake, to reappear. First one is Stanisław Witkiewicz. You have some of his works here in Munich. They're very hard to manage because they're mostly on pastel, and it's difficult to move them around. Pastel is very fragile. Here you have one of his masterpieces, which is here on the bottom, representing the Kraków. The very artist is on the top. He's quite a remarkable figure. He was a great painter, great designer, great playwright, great journalist to some extent. He was also a local politician. He was involved in so many activities that he was a sort of a Renaissance artist, Renaissance man, the genius in whatever he took part in terms of artistic expression. He is mostly remembered now for his pastels and stained glass designs and some oil paintings. And this is the first one I want to show you, and precisely we'll go step by step to rediscover the land that did not exist and how artists wanted to show it. So, places. Witkiewicz lived for most of his life in Kraków. In youth, he traveled around Europe. He was in Germany, he looked at German cathedrals, he was in France, he traveled through northern Italy. But then he studied in Paris for a few years, and he was there 3 times. But towards the end of his second half of his life, mature life, he settled in Kraków. And this is where he elaborated a very fantastic journey through the Kraków history. Kraków is a historic capital of Poland, a city in the southern Poland, which was in Wyspiański lifetime, so in the young Poland period, was a small city at the outskirts of Austro-Hungarian Empire. Was a fortress city, garrison city that was blocked by the Austrian army, its extension. So it was a very miserable city in a way, with a great historic past. And I think this juxtaposition and this tension precisely inspired Wyspiański to create his amazing works, where the monuments start to live. The historic monuments start to give a message once again. So this was precisely the case of the building which you see at the back, which is the royal castle on the Wawel Hill, and the cathedral of the Polish kings, where they are buried. So it's our Saint-Denis, if you like, or the church you have here with Wittelsbach. So this is a very holy burial place of Polish historic kingdom. And what happened to this castle in the Austrian partition? It became a soldier's barracks. So basically army lived there. It was impossible to access the place. It was controlled by the army. So it was a symbol of enslavement of Poland. Yet for Wyspiański, it becomes a symbol of rediscovery or recreation of Poland, precisely because in around 1900 there was a movement to restore the castle as an artistic monument and donated to the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph for his royal residence. It was the only way that Poles could do something about dilapidating castle, and they wanted to restore it. So in Wyspiański's lifetime, the castle starts to re-emerge as an artistic monument. Still, it's occupied army. So he paints it. You see at the end of the alley in the central Kraków. This is a garden that surrounds the old town. And this Wawel is appearing as behind the fog, as some kind of living memory, something that has to reappear, has to get once again a meaning, has to once again be important. So precisely this historic locality, it means that Poland exists there. It's not non-place. It is a place of particular importance, particular objects are representing it. And if you look carefully, there is a sign of hope in this painting. Precisely there's a lamp. It's an artificial light lamp. Kraków at that time got city lamps, finally. This is 1894, and these lamps, this is representing precisely the light of recreation. It is in a triangle if you look closely at it, so it resembles also the eye of God. So there is you can also read it as a sort of supernatural forces that signal the oncoming reemergence, awakening basically of the history hidden in the castle. He returns to this particular place in Kraków on and on in his works. Once again, you see the castle at the back. And beside the same plant area, we call this garden plants. You see, these are called kapschips in English, or as I try to get the German translation, this is made of straw. And it's Winterschutz for roses. Okay. So precisely a wonderful symbol he took from folk culture or peasant culture. There's a light inside that it's hidden against the winter, and at some point in spring, when spring comes, it will reemerge. It will reappear. It will be back in life. So young Poland, young Rose, will be living again. And he is representing this symbol in his playwrights, in his other artworks. Because for him it was the potent symbol of reawakening that he wanted with his art to stimulate. And I think, to make a clear point, this is exactly what Artur Górski was thinking about. That this is art that is full of romantic emotions, romantic feelings. It's not decadent. It speaks about actions. It speaks about the need to reawaken. It speaks to society. It has a message that would be understood by the contemporary public through Wyspiański works, through his explanation, through art criticism. So that is revolutionary art. It doesn't look revolutionary, but in fact has this revolutionary meaning. Also, if you look at other paintings he did in Kraków of apparently just landscapes, rather nice landscapes, winter landscapes, which he painted from his window in 1905. And they are representing the outskirts of Kraków. Kraków was probably the size of old town of Schwabing maybe, and old town in Munich, that's all. So it wasn't a very big city. This was a railway that was surrounding it. And at the back you see a hill, and at the top of this hill there is a small mound, like a small artificial mountain. And this is the actual theme of the work, because it's about looking at this particular Kościuszko mound. Kościuszko is the name of the Polish Belarusian, you would say today. His estate was in Belarus. Revolutionary who was a symbol of Polish resistance against Russian Empire at the end of 18th century. He led a Polish uprising against Russia in late 18th century. When he died in 1870, his corpse was taken over to Kraków. He was buried in the cathedral on the Wawel Hill, we just seen. But Poles created this artificial mound in his memory with the soil from all Polish partitions, from Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and also from other places where he fought. He also fought in the United States for freedom of United States. So they also brought the soil from United States to this particular mound. And it stands today very well protected, still as a symbol of 19th century cult of patriots, of heroes. So what Wyspiański is doing here, he's precisely reminiscing about Kościuszko and his role in Polish history, his role as a symbol of freedom. And it's a particular moment of the year because it's just before the spring starts. So the snow is melting. And this is exactly the symbol of, again, reawakening. So he's able to put so many meanings into apparently rather nice Japanese-inspired painting that would be understood by his public. Interestingly enough, 1905 was also the beginning of the war between Russia and Japan that the Russian Empire lost. It was beginning of the end of the Russian Empire as we knew it before the First World War. So in Poland, this war was great interest and great support. There were even manifestations in support of Japan in Warsaw, illegal, where students shouted in Japanese, "Freedom, freedom." And the fight for and the successful war of Japan was a sign of hope that the Russian Empire will disappear and Poland will regain its independence. So that's yet another historical context for this painting. We've seen history, we've seen geography. Now let's look at the other sources of revival that Wyspiański was very much looking at and emphasizing. This is a series of his stained glass windows in Franciscan Church in Kraków. He started to do it in 1897, finished 1904 with this huge, over 8 meters tall stained glass window representing God the Father. It is still very well preserved today in Kraków, representing the forces of nature and religion, again as a moment of recreation, of creation, because this is the moment when God is creating the world, is creating the earth. This is the western window of the church. The whole church is about nature. It's about Franciscan ideas. St. Francis' praise of nature as a symbol of God's revelation. But in this case, this is probably one of the greatest works of this expressionist style of Wyspiański, where religion also becomes a call for action. In fact, it was the first favorite stained glass window of Pope John Paul II, who used to pray nearby. And he refers to this often in his writings as a symbol of power that he got from Młoda Polska. So we see there are various people who are influenced by this work. In this very same church, Wyspiański also did a series of wonderful mural paintings representing flowers of typical Polish countryside. These are Nasturtiums, Nasturtie. They represent also the forces of vitality of nature that will give you a sign of hope, of revival. So religion and nature is a second source of the silent rebellion. Thirdly, we could talk also about the return to the classical values, because this is another important thing, that these people were extremely well educated in European culture, European historic traditions. Wyspiański here on the left, he is painting Apollo. This is also designed for stained glass window, this time for Medical Society, which was a society run like a medical club for doctors in Kraków. Kraków, by the way, while being a small and poor city, had a lot of rather wealthy residents, namely Polish aristocracy, Polish teachers, university teachers. So this the individual money was also the source of the commissions for people like Wyspiański. He's representing here Apollo as a god of sun, and around him you see the symbols of planets circling him, like in the Copernicus solar system. This was the second name of this stained glass window. Copernicus was then presented as although of German origin, but the son of Polish kingdom, the symbol of Polish historical importance in science. So that's why the subject of Apollo and Copernicus come together. So it's a classical tradition. Apollo, its symbolism of patron of arts, Copernicus is a symbol of science, and this is what Wyspiański is praising. He's saying we are part of a longer tradition, a longer culture that will be reawakened together with us. This stained glass window in the medical society is also a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk by Wyspiański, where he designed every part of the building, staircase with this balustrade, for instance, with chestnuts, and meeting rooms, even wall paintings. We'll see it at the very end of the lecture, where I will play a short film about the way the Kraków as a young Poland city looks today. And to conclude with Wyspiański, he's the best one, so I'll talk about him for so long. He's also fascinated with the idea of biological life reawakening and also the emotions of people, and how much the idea of individualism, precisely what Górski was advocating in his lecture, can be represented by arts. And there are a series of wonderful and amazingly moving portraits of children that he painted. And the way he's studying children is also rather unique. This is Józef Feldman, and this work is from a series of paintings of children that he did around 1905. Just a short focus on this particular individual, because it shows you what kind of society supported Wyspiański and who found Wyspiański a part of their own story. Józef Feldman was a younger son of Wilhelm Feldman, who came from an Orthodox Jewish family living near Lviv. And he became, in his lifetime, an ardent supporter of idea of assimilation, or let's say being Jew, but part of Polish culture. And he became a very influential and very fine literary critic, and also historian of literature. His books became a standard part of Polish cultural history. He was very much against these Hasidic movements in Galicia. So he thought that you have to be Jew and Pole in the same time, and this is how he educated also his children. So you see, Józef Feldman here is wearing a typical waistcoat for folk culture from Kraków area, and Józef Feldman himself became later a historian, rather well-known historian in Kraków University. He survived the war, hidden from the Holocaust in a monastery in Poland, and he became a Catholic at the very end of his life. So see, the fates of these people and that are represented by Wyspiański are sometimes really showing also the network of this, in consequence of this silent rebellion that ultimately won. And to conclude the personal stories, Wyspiański himself, through his own life, gave a symbol of crossing every possible border that allowed this revolution to start to happen. He married a peasant woman from a village near Kraków called Bronowice, and as a gesture of breaking social conventions. It was something unbelievable to cross these social differences at that time. The peasants were considered almost a different type of, different class of society. But in the same time, for artists, they were the source of revival too. Their culture, their vitality, their strength, their natural beauty, as it was called, were seen by artists as a source of revival of national art. Górski also talked about homely aspect of young Poland, and this is precisely what they found fascinating about the, for instance, folk dress. But not many crossed that threshold, so to say. Wyspiański and there were two other artists from Kraków art scene that married peasant women. It was really a very symbolic, outstanding gesture. And they did it with, this was not a political gesture, they did it because of love. This was a very good marriage, ultimately. But for them, it was also a statement that we have to unite the different social classes if we want to promote the idea of independence. And that we no longer can fight for it independently, upper classes away from the peasant classes. So this is how you should read also this self-portrait with his wife, saying this is also a statement. I am together with those that you don't expect, so the middle class, normal patrons of art, you don't expect to be part of Polish cultural history. No, they are essential part of Polishness. Okay, let's move on with other figures. Józef Mehofer, you have his works here represented. He was an Austrian, he came from Austrian family of well-known clerks who came to Poland because of the Austrian occupation, Austrian partition. But in the second generation, they already became Polish. It happened to quite a lot of them. So Mehofer became a Polish patriot because of his mother, who was Polish. His father was Austrian. And he painted this wonderful symbol of the beauty of the world that he wanted to find on planet Earth and in Poland. Strange Garden, the work from 1902-1903, representing his wife, who was also a painter. And in fact, they met in Paris, where she was studying painting, and together with her sister, who was a pianist, they were a very artistic family. She painted until the end of her life, but less than him. But still, she is kind of one of those women to be recognized still in the Polish art history. This is their newborn son. And you have this maid and this dragonfly at the top, a surreal object that somehow adds this strangeness to the garden, where this mysterious family ritual is taking place. So it's about life, love, and hidden symbols that appear in nature. This is where Mehofer was best at, in creating this almost surreal riddles in his paintings. This work is not in an exhibition, it's in Warsaw National Museum, but it was presented in Munich twice, in 1905, 1909. And here comes the Munich for the first time. And he was even awarded a medal at one of the international exhibitions in 1905. Just to let you know that a lot of these artists studied here or came to Munich to live here as part of their curriculum. Munich was a very important artistic center for whole Central Eastern Europe, Polish art included. Mehofer was also a versatile designer. He would design objects like this one. So the building of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Kraków, 1904-1906, where he designed basically a meeting hall for the members of this chamber. Chamber was one of those Polish independent economic organizations. The Polish industrialists organized in Austrian Galicia to strengthen the Polish economic class. And they wanted to have a rather nice seat in Kraków, so they commissioned Tadeusz Styliński and Franciszek Mączyński, two outstanding architects of Kraków, to design for them this building. This is still preserved today. It represents precisely the power of folk art, because Mehofer took, just like Wyspiański, from folk art also the inspiration of the vitality of revivalism. And in the middle you have his painting taming of four elements. So there's a human being here represented taming four elements, meaning it controls the earth and can benefit from dominating the earth for the sake of progress, technical progress. But the most amazing fact is that the greatest commission for Mehofer came from Switzerland, and this brings us back to the idea of international context of this artist, which I will refer to at the very end. This is Fribourg in Switzerland, in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, the Catholic part of Switzerland, where Mehofer won a commission to decorate the St. Nicholas Church. He won it already in 1897, when he was a very young artist in Paris, studying in Paris, and he worked on that commission until mid-1930s. It's not far from Munich. I would advise you, if you ever are in Switzerland and this city, have a look at amazing stained glass windows, complete set that's dedicated to the saints of Switzerland, the saints of Catholic Church, and there are also elements of Polish iconography, especially representation of Wawel Castle, which we already know from Wyspiański work. And here Nehofer shows his ability to speak the international language of Art Nouveau too. Two more figures. Vitor Voitkiewicz, fantastically represented in your exhibition. The artist who again gave this new expected revival. It's the psychological, emotional depth. This is a work called Meditations, Ash Wednesday, 1905, where he started to paint rituals of everyday life with an expression of satire, irony, melancholy. Artists who sort of discovered individualism as a part of the young Poland turn to individual experience of life that has to be venerated. Once again, to give you his international context, in 1905 he exhibited in Berlin Schulte's Salon, where he was noticed by French critic Andrzej Gide and French painter Maurice Denis. They took him then to Paris, and he had exhibition in Paris. He was considered by Andrzej Gide on par with artists such as Edvard Munch of Norway. So he was very much representing this decadent expressionist part of Art Nouveau. He was also well known for his paintings of children. You have it a lot in your exhibition. Olga Boznańska, the only of that grandeur women painter of this period, which is still exceptional to make such a career for women in arts around the world. She is famous for this painting, which we have in the exhibition, of unknown city from Munich, by the way. It was painted in Munich in 1894 at the child, small girl with chrysanthemum. This was praised also in France for being exhibited there. She was, again, like Witkiewicz, focusing on the psychological emotions that people could read through paintings. She lived in Munich for 12 years, from 1886 to 1898. Then she moved to Paris, which was then an even better cultural capital than Munich for Art Nouveau artists. It's important to see her work also as a part of this international context of Polish artists. They were represented internationally, even if their recognition was an individual one. And that's why, in a way, this is how they struggled to place this Poland back also on a cultural map of Europe. Now, my second point is about geography of Young Poland period, Young Poland art. First of all, it is an urban phenomenon. It happens in the major cities. It's looking at the heritage of Kraków, to some extent of Warsaw, also in Polish-speaking cities, then Lviv, and to some extent Vilnius. In the same time, the cities gain new buildings to exhibit art. The art is being venerated by the societies in the cities. This is Palace of Art in Kraków of 1897, built especially to exhibit new art and to find for its own public. But importantly enough, it also happens in the countryside. It happens in the countryside, namely, especially in places far away from the city centers, which are considered the residues of national culture. And the most amazing and the most principal of them is a place called Zakopane, which is south of Kraków, about 100 kilometers. It's a then small village at the footsteps of our mountains, the Tatra Mountains, part of Carpathian Mountains. Today it's a rather big winter resort. But when it was discovered at the end of 1870s, it was really a small village. It was discovered as a place, as a sanatorium, first of all, but then a lot of artists and art patrons came there to support revival of art, and this is the key thing, based on the local folk culture tradition of Highlanders, known in Polish as Górale, that was considered to be the element of Polishness, the symbol of Polishness. hidden somewhere far away in distant land, away from international influences, and therefore quintessentially Polish. And among many artists who read this folk art culture in that national way, the most important was Stanisław Witkiewicz. He was a painter, also studied in Munich for some time in the 1880s, but then he moved to Zakopane, 1870s, and then he moved to Zakopane in mid-1880s because he had to cure his pneumonia. So he was very ill to the end of his life. 1915 he dies. And then he discovered here the beauty of the wooden architecture, the wooden ornaments of the Highlanders, and he thought this is precisely the material with which I can create the national style of Poland. This is very common in Europe then. In Germany, you have the Heimatstil idea, you have the same in Hungary, in Czech, in Slovakia, Scandinavia. So he is our sort of chapter in this history. He represented with one of these local artists and builders, Wojciech Roy, who was also a great guide in mountains. And he helped him then to execute the actual buildings. He believed he can only do it together with the Highlanders. And it's important to see that this was a new national art that was emerging from the lower classes of the society. This was also a very important political message in it. We talked about it with Wyspiański already, but one has to also remember that the idea that you have to recreate the style for whole Europe based on the folk culture was revolutionary. The folk culture was always seen as a second class, as a kind of a curiosity, fancy. Now it was to become a source of new art, new national style. And he called this style the Zakopane style, obviously. And these are two examples of his works. This is mostly about architecture, interior design basically. The houses that he built in 1890s, Villa Koliba at the left and Villa House under the Firs, Villa under the Firs on the right-hand side for Polish nobility who lived in Zakopane, again because of health reasons, but also as a way to strengthen the local cultural community. Zakopane became a kind of Zauberberg, really. It became a place where all those artistic societies met, and from all three partitions. It was a beautiful, favorite place for them to meet. So that's why they had these houses. They were designed by Witkiewicz, executed by the local craftsmen. And as you see, he tried to refine this folk culture, to give it a new elaborate, exclusive look. It became quickly a symbol of national revival too, to such an extent that it was presented at art exhibitions. This is Witkiewicz built this model of this villa under the Firs for a 1900 exhibition in Paris, the World Exhibition in Paris. It was supposed to be represented in Austrian Pavilion. You can actually open it and see inside how it looks inside. It's very well executed. It's preserved today in Tatra Museum in Zakopane. It never came to Paris. It was rejected as too Polish in a way, as too politically incorrect for Austrians who organized this exhibition, because if this was to be presented, it would have been presented as an Austrian exhibition, part of Austrian exhibition. This was the only way that Poles would be represented in 1900. So you see, this is also about struggle, how to be visible on this map, and sometimes not visible. This house under the Firs survived communism intact. It is still in private hands, and I'm talking about communism because this was the moment when usually private houses in Poland were completely run down or robbed. Frankly speaking, it started in the Second World War with German Nazis coming and destroying them. Then the Bolsheviks came, and ultimately the Polish communists finished them. But this house is in private hands still, and it's fantastic in its interior fittings, where everything is designed by Witkiewicz and the local craftsmen. So you see the wardrobes, you see the chairs, tables, ceramic stoves. It's all about the beauty of the folk art elevated to the status of high art. That's the drawing room, or the main room of the house, with the view over the mountains. It's still a breathtaking beauty Also, the beauty of wood is here represented. All the ornaments come from the Górale folk culture. Witkiewicz also designed other buildings in this style, notably chapels, interior of churches. This is the chapel of Jaszczurówka, part of Zakopane, from 1904. He found followers among the local artists, also of Highlanders origin. And just to show you one that was recently rediscovered, and in this London exhibition that was mentioned in the introduction, we showed him for the first time internationally, Karol Wazowski. He is famous for many works, but especially for these paper cuts that was created. They were created on the pattern of the Highlanders ornamentation. He did it for money. He sold it as decorations for houses, and he was extremely creative in using these ornaments and placing them in all places in his house. His house is like a second. It didn't survive that well as the Villa pod Jedlami, but it's still possible to visit its exterior, again decorated with the folkloric ornaments. He's on the border of Art Deco already in some of it. He worked also in the interwar period. The Zakopane style idea lived on. It never became really international style in the sense that it was not built away from Zakopane area, although there were attempts to transfer this architecture even to Lithuania, to Warsaw, to Kraków, the individual houses with some ornamentation. But in Zakopane, it is a kind of regional style until today. For instance, the Polish composer, which I will show you at the end with the film, Karol Szymanowski, bought for himself such a Zakopane-style villa in 1926 called Atma. It's part of our museum now, and it shows how much the idea of regional style lived on. To summarize, the Zakopane style was about new form, so it was a new style. It was about politics, as I told you, this idea of uniting society, and about economy, because as with Kłosowski, Witkiewicz thought that if he gives the Highlanders work to actually elaborate this new national art style works, they would basically make money, and the poverty that was widespread among them will be definitely defeated. So it was on purpose that these things were also a kind of economical project. And that's why you can call this national style also a kind of a modernizing agent in the society. And this idea of national style lives on, and I think this has to be remembered to see the paintings that you see in Munich now in the proper context. Two societies founded 1901, Polish Applied Art Society, and 1913 Kraków Workshops. They carried on this idea of new style that would be based both on international influences, but especially on the local folk art culture and local artistic traditions. And they were extremely successful in doing that before the First World War. And to some extent, their message was carried on in the interwar period, so 1920s and 30s. Few examples only. Jan Bukowski, who was a graphic designer, this is what he designs a journal published by the society about how to elaborate folk art into efficient new style. But he was also able to create these monumental decorations in churches, like the Jesuit church in Kraków, 1909-1921, where he also designed stained glass windows. So you see what it meant folk art for them. It really was a source of vitality, amazing new forms. It was more interesting than abstract art. It was more interesting than geometry. It was more interesting than academic traditions. It was more interesting than decadent art. This is what they were able to create out of it. So Jan Bukowski, and as you see, they try to work in different media. They try to create a style that really encompasses both applied art, fine art, and also decorative arts. They also were hoping to create new Polish architecture that would be move away from this stylistics of Zakopane style, which was mainly visual, and to create a sort of synthesis of folk traditions, Polish manor houses built by nobility in classicist style, and basically new modern architecture that was emerging already in Europe in the early 20th century. So this is an exhibition they organized in 1912 in Kraków, so just before the First World War. It was called the Architecture in Gardens exhibition, where they showed 4 model houses for different social classes that they deemed to be national in its form, and possibly the patterns to be repeated in the creation of Polish cities, Polish countryside settlements. This is Polish manor house for nobility, it's for the upper classes. This is for working class family on the right hand side, and the most amazing, the best one is on the left by Adolf Szyszko Bochusz. This was a house for craftsmen with his studio on the top, and here was the house for the peasants. So I'm just trying to show you what kind of all-encompassing idea was this young Poland, and what was to be rejuvenated, including architecture. Interiors of these houses were fitted with most elaborate, in case of the upper classes, house fittings by Karol Tichy with this new geometricism, but also the working class house or the peasants were rather nicely fitted with what looks like Scandinavian design of that period. It was kind of pre-IKEA almost. You would think it's a simplicity, well-designed, affordable, and I think this idea was also very close to the spirit of young Poland, because again, it was based in a way on folk art, on wood design and simple ornaments, but it was fitted for the taste and financial capabilities of many as widespread society as possible. Last but not least, they also created institutions that supported this revival. The most important of them was Museum of Industry and Technology in Kraków. This is its seat, built in 1914, finished just before the First World War started. It's in Kraków, by Mączyński and Stryjeński with ferro-concrete or reinforced concrete construction. Again, it's sort of already simplicity of 20th century architecture, if you like. But inside it's the Gesamtkunstwerk with all media included. This is the staircase. Okay. These works that were exhibited in this museum were also workshops for designers function, and where you could come and ask artists to design something for you, and then craftsmen would execute it, and then you could try to sell it in the market. So they are just examples of what they produced there. It was a variety of works, tapestries, textiles, furniture, or wood, made in wood, but also in metal. I don't want to talk about details, it's just to give you the idea of the complexity of this project. In fact, we showed it in London last year, but the most impressive, apparently the London public liked the most this, namely the paper toys for Christmas tree. And they were created by Zdzisław Gedliczka, and then also by Zofia Stryjeńska, these wooden toys for children. They were created by artists in such a way that you could create them yourself. They were basically patterns to be repeated at home. You do it very, very easily with paper, and you need eggs. And the eggs, you see, if you want to have such a beautiful fish, this is egg, and this is you have to glue very carefully the paper cuts, and then you get the fish, or you have this fantastic pig, and this is made just of paper. So this is an idea, and believe it or not, but there was a real cultural fight about the Christmas tree decorations. They said, we need Polish Christmas tree decorations. We don't want German products, we don't want Austrian products, not to mention Russian products. We need Polish, right? And this idea of the beauty in everyday life was also had this idea of kind of social, political, this is a really silent rebellion, isn't it? And my last point is about what also this exhibition is making very clear, and I think it's also interesting, is talk about geography in the sense that we talk so much about, and rightly, about this national context of this art. But at the same time, we have to remember that these artists were very versatile in the international scene, international context. They were basically artists educated and well-traveled in Europe and not only. For instance, Tadeusz Stryjeński, the architect of this museum that we just seen, was for 4 years, if I'm not mistaken, a governmental architect in Peru, in Lima. He got this commission there and he went there to work. He also studied in Zurich Polytechnic, for instance. So it's important to remember that they reached this level of expertise in art, in artistic scene, because they were also internationally traveled and educated. But they were able to turn this international inspirations and knowledge and context into their own unique language. But just to give you a few examples of the careers, if you like, of these artists abroad. We talked already about successes of Mehofer, of Poznańska. Henryk Siemiradzki was a Polish artist from Polish family born in Ukraine, in Kharkiv. And he studied in Kharkiv first, in mathematics and nature studies. Then he studied art in St. Petersburg Academy. But in the 1870s, on the way to Munich, by the way, he also is part of your story here. He discovered the Polish culture as he was traveling through Kraków, so he rediscovered it. And he suddenly started to feel less international and more Polish. But then in 1872, he moved to Rome and he settled there permanently, and his studio became one of the most famous studios, artistic studios in Rome. You see the picture of it at the bottom. And he was famous for painting these idyllic scenes of Roman period. They were sold everywhere in Europe. He's considered one of the most successful, also financially, artists of the period. Josef Brandt, again, the sort of a teacher of the generation of young Polish artists, of regeneration. He stayed in Munich from 1860s. 1862 he came here first, and he became so successful here that he established his own studio. And today I checked this place; it's no longer existing, but it's on the corner of Goethestrasse and Schwanthalerstrasse, so near the Hauptbahnhof. Yes, the cities exist, but the studio, of course, doesn't. And Brandt was so financially successful that he even established a series of scholarships for Polish painters who came to study in Munich, and he supported them. So this is this picture of Munich, of his studio. He worked. He got a lot of prizes here. He was a member of Bavarian Academy. He got his Bavarian nobility. He got the Order of Maximilian of Bavaria. So he was a part of this city very much. In the same time, thinking about his subjects and his importance for Polish art scene and for Polish students who came here. He supported, for instance, Poznańska when she came to Munich. Jantek Mancheski, again in your exhibition present, again an artist who has a Munich connection. He came here for a few months in 1885 and then once again in 1892. He started work with Brandt. He wasn't formally part of any academy here, but he studied the local art scene, and this is an obvious comparison with many artists of Munich generation that could have influenced him, or he looked at their art. This is Lovis Corinth, one of the best Bavarian painters, and this painting, where they are both in armor, shows how there are some unexpected affinities between these artists. By the way, this work is in Poznań, in the city of Poznań, which was bought by the German director of the local museum in the early 20th century, as Poznań was then part of Germany. So, and it still stays in Poznań, is very much appreciated, obviously. We have to also remember that these artists were members of international societies, such as Viennese Secession. Wojciech Weiss, whom you have here in the exhibition, is one of the prominent members, but also artists such as Mehofer, Wyspiański, and others were exhibiting with the most advanced society in Austria. Obviously, there was for them an important network of working. So why shouldn't they do this? Society of Polish Artists, Sztuka, Polish Art Nouveau artists were exhibiting as part of Austrian Empire. This is exhibition in 1905, 1906 in London. There were individual stories, sometimes almost funny. Bolesław Biegas, he came from the peasant family, was educated in Kraków and then in Paris, became one of the most popular symbolist sculptors in Paris. And in fact, his work is from the Musée d'Orsay collection. It's exhibited permanently in Paris. When they say he's of Polish origin, but he's representing the Parisian art scene around 1900. On the right-hand side, you have Julien Apollinaire, the French poet whose mother was Polish, and he Kostrowicka. So if you read closely his poetry, he always signs it Julien Apollinaire de Kostrowicki, and he liked to somehow fantasize about his Polish roots as giving him this surreal origin. La Revue Blanche, where he also published, was a journal very influential for Parisian Art Nouveau, which was co-founded by three brothers Nathanson of the Polish Jewish family from Warsaw in 1890s. Also, the people like Stanislav Chushevsky and Dagny Juez, who was important for Berlin art scene and then for Scandinavia, and she herself an artist and poet who married him. She was his third wife. And again, looking at this international context is quite amazing. When you go to Kraków, there's a house where they lived. Dagny and Przybyszewski, they came from Berlin to Kraków around 1900, but then they split, and she ultimately went with her lover to Tbilisi in Georgia, and then he killed herself and himself as a sign of despair. So she's buried in Tbilisi. So imagine what kind of networks and kind of love and passion is in this period hidden and still invisible on the map. There was also an important British influence on the art scene, especially in arts and crafts. There were individual Polish artists who studied in England, like Bonaventura Lenart, book designer. And last but not least, in the transatlantic, so to say, context, there are also Polish artists present, like Eugeniusz Zach, who was a Polish Jewish artist from Warsaw. And he again, these are these assimilated Jews who thought that while retaining their Jewish identity, they are part of Polish culture. He was a great friend of Chagall. They came from the same part of Belarus. To complicate it even further, he was part of the Armory show, the famous show in 1930 in New York City, which is considered to be the first show of modern art in the United States in 20th century. So you see his name here on the poster among the great artists of, especially of Paris and Germany too. And last but not least, Polish art was appreciated by art criticism internationally. There were writers such as Amalia Sara Levetus, writing for the magazine The Studio in England, or Berta Zuckerkandl in Austria, in Vienna, devoting regularly coverage to Polish artists. They were never as popular as the French or German or others, Belgians. But still, they were visible, and I think it's one of those great questions: what happened that they disappeared from our cultural map or mental map of Europe after 1914, when this period definitely ends? By the way, Zuckerkandl wrote fantastic studies about their art, and both Levetus and Zuckerkandl, they write that they are speaking international language, but they are very Polish, and they enjoyed about them this unique Polish look that they discovered in art of Wyspiański, Mehofer, and so on and so forth. To conclude, let me show you a short clip about the Kraków Art Nouveau scene. But maybe we finish with this map. We started with the journal, but we finish with this map. I definitely love this idea of Worldmapper. This is a Sheffield University idea. They create maps based on statistics. So they create, this is the map of the world according to number of populations. So you see what's bigger, what's less big. So geography that we know from these maps can be definitely rewritten. And it's always a question for me, what kind of map of Europe should be a cultural map of Europe if we attached to it the Polish art scene, Hungarian or Central Eastern European basically. How would it change? Because definitely at the moment it's less visible. But if we take into consideration its historic value, and I think it's still the importance today, I think it probably would look a bit different than from the map that we have already in mind. Okay, so to conclude, a film that shows you the context of the works that we've seen. Thank you very much.